I was only 19 when I met Bruce, the man who would turn my life into a real-life fairy tale. He was older, impossibly successful, and knew how to live life on his terms. Our wedding was a whirlwind of silk and champagne, and once we were married, I entered a world of wealth I'd only dreamed about. Bruce adored spoiling me, insisting my only duties were to keep our beautiful home and care for our son. From the beginning, our life together was nothing short of extravagant. We'd jet off to Europe, often winding our way through Paris, my favorite city in the world, where we'd indulge in everything the City of Light had to offer. Bruce could see how I lit up there, and every time he promised we'd return. Back home, I kept our house in pristine condition, setting an atmosphere of elegance in every room. 3 times a day, I prepared elaborate meals fit for the life Bruce had given us. It was part of my routine, and over time I found I enjoyed the challenge of crafting feasts that matched the high standard of our life. Even our son, young as he was, had an exceptional sense of taste. Bruce's influence was clear in the fine clothes he wore, his sophisticated interests, and the way he carried himself. Then there was the yacht. One day, Bruce came home with a glint in his eye, like he had a secret. "I bought something," he said, smiling as if he'd hidden a treasure. And there it was, a beautiful, gleaming yacht. He named it Sweet Caroline after me. It was his grand gesture, a symbol of how he saw me, his treasured, cherished Carol. We spent weekends on that yacht, our own little floating paradise, surrounded by opulence and the open sea. As the years passed and our son grew older, the fairy tale began to fade. What had once been a blissful, carefree life felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Bruce started spending more time away from home, his once warm attentiveness turning into a polite, distant smile. It began with business trips that stretched longer and later nights at the office, but soon it was clear he was deliberately pulling away. I convinced myself it was in my head, but there were too many signs. Texts he'd quickly swipe away, mysterious phone calls he'd take out of earshot. He started coming home with faint traces of unfamiliar perfumes, and once even had lipstick on the collar of his shirt. My heart sank every time he walked through the door a little later, with another vague excuse. The trust I once had in him eroded day by day, replaced by a gnawing suspicion I couldn't shake. The weight of it all started to pull me down. I turned to wine to fill the silence and drown out the emptiness, pouring glass after glass just to make it through the long nights. I told myself it was only to take the edge off, but it quickly became a lifeline. The more Bruce stayed out, the more I needed it. Before I knew it, that glass of wine turned into bottles, and the bottles became a nightly ritual that numbed the hurt. One night, I drank too much, and in a fit of frustration decided to leave. I got behind the wheel of my Mercedes, my emotions blurring with the headlights, my mind a haze of anger and betrayal. I don't even remember what I was thinking or where I intended to go. All I remember is the sharp, jarring crash and the flashing blue lights that followed. I was charged with a DUI, and my once perfect world felt like it had come crashing down just as violently as my car had. It felt like I was watching my life unravel from a distance. The glamorous life I'd built with Bruce, the seemingly perfect family. Suddenly, it was all in jeopardy, and I couldn't help but feel that I was powerless to stop it. Bruce's success story was impressive. He'd built a fortune as a real estate developer and investor, buying up properties, transforming them, and selling them for a profit. His keen eye for location and style meant he could spot opportunities others missed, turning old homes into showpieces and flipping properties with a flawless touch. Each project, from small renovations to luxury developments, seemed to build his empire higher, adding more wealth and connections to his name. Over time, he became a powerhouse in the industry, respected for his knack for taking risks that paid off handsomely. Around the time our marriage began to unravel, Bruce hired a young man named Steve to work on construction across his sites. Steve was everything Bruce wasn't. He was 15 years younger than me, rugged, and had a charm that seemed to exude from him effortlessly. The first time I saw him, I felt a spark, a thrill I hadn't felt in years. He was lively, attentive, and his smile had a way of lingering just long enough to make me feel seen, something I hadn't felt in my marriage for a long time. At first, it was all innocent, a friendly hello, a little small talk when I'd visit the sites to bring Bruce lunch. But Steve had a way of making those moments feel electric. He'd compliment me with a natural, disarming ease, slipping in little flirty comments that reminded me I was still desirable. He was relentless, playful and charming, subtly pursuing me with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. Before long, the attraction between us was undeniable, and the excitement became intoxicating. Steve wooed me slowly, leaning in with tender glances, showing up unexpectedly just to see me. finding any reason to touch my hand or brush against me. He'd whisper that I deserved more, that I shouldn't be left alone as Bruce had been doing. Eventually, that thrill turned into more, and we began a passionate affair. I hadn't felt so alive in years. He filled a void that I hadn't realized had grown so vast. But secrets like that don't stay hidden forever. Bruce began to notice the change, how often I'd leave, the new life in my eyes, the energy that hadn't been there before. One night, he confronted me cold and direct, with evidence he'd uncovered, a trail of messages and emails. I remember his face, a mixture of anger and heartbreak. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked at me with a sadness I'd never seen before. The next morning, I found an envelope waiting for me. Bruce had served me with divorce papers. The reality hit me like a tidal wave, the life I'd known suddenly slipping through my fingers, replaced by a stark, uncertain future. Bruce's decision was swift, his message clear. He was done. Steve's life was worlds apart from mine. He barely had enough to get by, relying on the work Bruce provided to make ends meet. Yet even knowing this, I was willing to risk everything, to leave behind the comfort and stability of being Bruce's wife, for a life with him. He made me feel alive and free in a way I hadn't felt in years. And somehow, that seemed worth more than the luxury I'd come to know. With the divorce pending and Bruce's money still at my disposal, Steve and I set out to experience the world. I wanted to show him the places I loved, to give him a taste of the lifestyle I had lived, even if it was only temporary. We started with a sun-soaked escape to the Caribbean, Steve's first time on a tropical island. The warmth, the ocean, and the cocktails. Steve was mesmerized, and seeing him so full of joy made me feel like I'd made the right choice. Then we traveled to Europe, savoring every experience as if it were our last, strolling through Italy, sipping coffee in the bustling squares of Spain, and finally returning to France, my favorite. Those moments were pure bliss, but reality eventually set in. With our separation now official, I was forced to leave the home I had once kept so meticulously. With nowhere else to go, I moved into a modest studio apartment in the same complex as Steve. I'd gone from grand rooms and endless space to a tiny, cramped apartment where the walls felt like they were closing in. To make ends meet, I took a job at JCPenney. After years of being a housewife with every luxury at my fingertips, the retail work was jarring. I'd gone from planning elaborate meals to working the sales floor, clocking in and out like everyone else. I barely recognized my life, and each day I grappled with the stark contrast between my past and present. But I refused to let these inconveniences stop me from pursuing a new life with Steve. After the DUI, Bruce used his connections to ensure it was resolved as quietly as possible. I completed the necessary legal requirements, and while the incident left a mark, it ultimately faded into the background of the more turbulent events that would follow. In the divorce, I was awarded a modest settlement, just enough to buy a small house outright. It wasn't the mansion I had once called home, but it was ours, and that felt like a fresh start. Steve and I moved in, determined to build a life together. Despite our 15-year age gap, our love remained strong. Meanwhile, Bruce moved on. He found another young woman, Vanessa, and, before long, he married her. I heard through friends that he had started a family with her, and they'd welcomed a sweet, beautiful baby boy. Seeing him rebuild so quickly, creating the family I'd once envisioned for us, was difficult to accept. I tried to focus on my new life with Steve and the fresh start we'd been given. He brought a new energy into my life, and I clung to that, convinced that we could make this new chapter work. For a time, Steve and I thrived, leaning into our relationship and the life we were creating. But soon, things took a turn. After more than 12 years together, Vanessa filed for divorce from Bruce, sparking a cascade of events that would unravel everything once more. Vanessa and Bruce's marriage had always seemed stable from the outside, but when their divorce began, everything changed. They had a prenup, leaving Vanessa with little claim to his fortune. Desperate to keep her position in his home, Vanessa accused him of domestic abuse one night. The claims were completely false, but the police responded swiftly, and Bruce was taken into custody. Alone and with nowhere else to turn, Bruce called me. Despite everything between us, I couldn't ignore the call. I immediately went to the police station, bailed him out, and told him he could stay at my place until his arraignment on Monday. When we arrived, Steve was less than thrilled, but he tolerated Bruce for the weekend, knowing the situation was temporary. However, things didn't go as planned. At the arraignment, the judge granted Vanessa a temporary restraining order, forcing Bruce out of his own house indefinitely. It became clear he couldn't return home, and with a criminal trial and divorce proceedings looming, he was trapped. What started as a temporary stay turned into weeks, then months. Steve grew more resentful by the day, his frustration bubbling to the surface every time he saw Bruce in our space. This wasn't the life he'd signed up for, and as the days dragged on, I felt the tension building between us, threatening to tear apart the life we'd tried so hard to build. As time went on, Steve seemed to spend less and less time at home. When he did come back, it was tense and uncomfortable. He'd barely say a word to me or Bruce, slamming doors and muttering under his breath before disappearing again. Bruce, meanwhile, took advantage of Steve's absence to make himself more comfortable, as if this were his home and not just a temporary refuge. Our conversations were nothing like the ones we used to have. Bruce became condescending, speaking with a tone that reminded me of the old days, as if he were the only one who truly understood what it meant to have wealth. He'd go on and on about money, about how poor people simply didn't understand life's finer things, and how a poor man would never amount to anything worthwhile. His disdain was obvious, and his comments about Steve grew sharper by the day, often muttering that Steve was leeching off me just like he did off him. This only fueled Steve's frustration. He started drinking heavily, his anger simmering below the surface until it exploded in fits of rage. I'd hear him shouting from across the living room, venting his frustration that even 6 months after I'd bailed Bruce out, he was still living with us. A constant reminder of everything Steve felt he couldn't provide. The situation was like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode, with all of us trapped in a storm that no one knew how to calm. As things continued to unravel, Steve's frustration reached a boiling point. One evening, he went to his best friend Bobby's house to blow off steam. They drank heavily, and Steve poured out his anger about Bruce's constant presence. Bobby, trying to lift his spirits, introduced him to what he called the mirror effect. He told Steve, "If Bruce walks around your house in his underwear, then you walk around your house naked. Show him who's in charge." Fueled by alcohol and Bobby's encouragement, Steve stormed back home later that night. Without hesitation, he stripped off his clothes and began pacing around the backyard, yelling, "This is my house!" His voice echoed through the rooms, and I felt my face go red with embarrassment. I had never seen him so unhinged. It was shocking, and all I could think was how much further things had spiraled out of control, with Bruce now witnessing just how far Steve was willing to go to make a point. As time dragged on, things only got worse. Steve's drinking escalated, and his resentment toward Bruce became all-consuming. Bruce's belittling comments about Steve's lack of wealth and his constant reminders of what it meant to be a real man chipped away at Steve's confidence. I could see the toll it was taking. Steve was angrier than ever, and there were no signs that Bruce was planning to leave. Then, 7.5 months into our ordeal, Bruce finally settled his divorce with Vanessa. She walked away with a 6-figure payout and child support, no alimony. Suddenly, Bruce was free to move back into his own home. Just as abruptly as he'd entered our lives, he left, returning to his house and moving on. But the damage had already been done. 7 months of Bruce's scorn had left Steve deeply hurt, humiliated, and drinking to the point of passing out in the backyard. Bruce's entire stay had been filled with condescension and thinly veiled insults, and now Steve could barely look at me. He hadn't touched me in months, or told me he loved me, and a hollow silence had replaced our former closeness. Looking back, it was clear to me that Bruce's only reason for staying here was to get back at me, to drive a wedge between Steve and me. Today, Bruce is enjoying his newfound freedom, with his 26-year-old Argentinian girlfriend Delfina by his side, while I was left wondering if my relationship with Steve could ever recover. The uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on me as I faced the difficult reality of the life I'd chosen and the distance that now stood between Steve and I. Looking back on those chaotic months, it's painfully clear that Bruce's stay wasn't just a necessity due to his sudden divorce. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. He knew exactly what he was doing when he called me from that jail cell, planting the seeds that would eventually choke out my relationship with Steve. He came into my home not as the helpless ex-husband he presented himself to be, but as a man with a vendetta, a man who was never going to let me leave him for someone he considered beneath him. Every sneer, every underhanded comment, and every patronizing glance was calculated. He used his wealth and influence as weapons, reminding Steve at every opportunity that he was the man I had once chosen, the man who could provide the lavish lifestyle I once adored. Bruce spoke endlessly about money, turning his presence into a constant reminder of the luxuries and privileges Steve couldn't provide, subtly implying that love without wealth was doomed to fail. With a calm, practiced ruthlessness, Bruce undermined Steve's confidence, whittling away at his sense of self-worth, knowing full well how damaging it would be. He watched our relationship with calculated patience, waiting for the cracks to appear. The 7 months he stayed with us weren't about him needing a place to go. They were about asserting dominance, proving that no one could replace him in my life or offer me the stability and comfort he once had. By the time he left, he'd accomplished exactly what he set out to do. Steve, battered by months of humiliation and emasculation, had withdrawn from me, leaving us both in a strained silence that was once unthinkable. In the end, Bruce walked away triumphant, slipping back into his former life and moving on with a younger girlfriend, while I was left grappling with the fallout. His scheme to sabotage my relationship with Steve had succeeded, and he knew it. In this twisted full circle, Bruce had avenged my choice to leave him, not with rage or drama, but with cold, quiet control, planting seeds of doubt and resentment that grew into an inevitable distance between Steve and me. Bruce had exacted his revenge in a way only he could, leaving me to question the life I'd rebuilt and the love I'd fought so hard to protect.